This week on The Sceptic, I speak to David Goodhart, journalist, author and head of demography at Policy Exchange, about his new book, The Care Dilemma, Freedom, Family and Fertility. We discuss gender roles and why family policy is coming back on the agenda, anywheres versus somewheres, and the consequences of immigration and demographic change.
There has been this extraordinary change. In 2000, the country was about 90% white British, and it is now, certainly if you look at England, it is barely 70%. It is possible to feel that change is loss. And the anywheres let themselves off by saying it's racist or nativist or xenophobic, to think and feel that. And I simply don't think it is.
Eugippius, The Sceptic's Germany correspondent, on what the German media's response to the Charlie Kirk killing says about its politics.
The idea of going after and defaming a murdered man from another country who has nothing to do with German politics, with whom Germans have no quarrel at all, it's bizarre.
And for our premium subscribers, he explains the extraordinary lengths he has to go to protect himself from Germany's woke Stasi.
Encrypt everything, get rid of all old electronics, have only a few devices with me all the time. Being constantly vigilant about the possibility of having your devices raided is something that has really changed my life in the past 2 years or so.
Hello and welcome to episode 52 of The Sceptic, the Daily Sceptic's weekly podcast. I'm your host, Laurie Wastell, an associate editor at the Daily Sceptic. And I'm very pleased to be joined today here in the studio by David Goodhart, who is a journalist, the founder of Prospect magazine in 1995. He's the head of demography at the think tank Policy Exchange and the author of several books, including The Road to Somewhere, Head, Hand, Heart, and most recently, The Care Dilemma, Freedom, Family and Fertility. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Welcome to The Sceptic, David.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, very good to have you here. So we'll start with the care dilemma.
Yeah.
I suppose in some ways it's not the most hot button political topic. There are more sort of strident things that perhaps provoke the emotions more. But So what is it that prompted you to write the care dilemma?
Yeah, I think I'm trying to sort of bring to the surface some of the sort of subterranean problems in our society. Well, they're not that subterranean, but they often run below the radar. And I rather grandly call this book, The Care Dilemma, the third in my kind of anywhere critique trilogy. The first book, The Road to Somewhere, you mentioned, was where I talk about this education-based value divide that has become such an important new division in our politics, if you like, in the last 15, 20 years between the more highly educated anywheres who tend to value, tend to be university graduates, tend to value, partly because they've experienced it, mobility, openness, autonomy, tend to be comfortable with change. The somewheres, on the other hand, tend to be much less well educated, more rooted, more their identities based much more on place and the group they come from, and therefore much more discomforted by change. That's gone into the political vocabulary somewhat in this country at least. And then I had, as you also mentioned, the head, hand, heart, the struggle for identity and status, which kind of dug a bit deeper into the whole, the high status attached to certain kinds of analytical intelligence, the exam passing sort of abilities that are highly valued and highly rewarded, the upper professional class, which kind of runs the country. And that leads on to certain policies and being relatively uninterested in the decline of heavy industry, say, and promoting everybody going to university in the education sphere. Various biases that we've seen play out in policies in the last 20 or 30 years. And this third book, I think, is also looking at a sort of at an anywhere failure, if you like, or an anywhere bias that has had quite damaging effects on our country. And it is the kind of bias of the very public, the successful public realm oriented professional person who tends to downplay the importance of family in the domestic realm in a way that still, I think, the majority of people in the country don't. And the downplaying of the domestic realm and the family, I think, has had. It has all sorts of deep roots. At a kind of sort of higher sort of more slightly meta level, one might say it is the victory of a certain idea of freedom that has become so dominant for both men and women in recent decades. I mean, the idea of freedom as lack of constraint, you can sort of see it everywhere. I mean, the idea that life is about individual self-actualization is an incredibly powerful kind of momentum in our zeitgeist. And that has, if we place too much emphasis on freedom, then we lose out in so many other ways in our lives. And, I think I talk in the book about how, we're much richer than just 20 or 30 years ago. We're much richer. We're much better educated. We're much more able to choose our life course, particularly if we're a woman, than would have been the case 1 or 2 generations ago. On the other hand, we're much more likely to live alone. We're much more likely to suffer from depression. We're much less likely to have children. And if we are a child, we're much less likely to live with both of our biological parents even by our early teens. Nearly half of children in the UK do not live with both their biological parents at the age of 14. And it's an astonishing that family instability. I mean, that all of these, this is why it's a dilemma, because we've got a lot of positive things, particularly for women much less defined by motherhood and being a wife. The huge movement of women from the home into both jobs and professional careers in the last 50 or 60 years. Obviously, a huge step forward, probably the biggest step forward in human freedom since 1945. That autonomy financial autonomy has been incredibly important. And that is why this is a dilemma, because the greater freedom to, end unhappy marriages, to end relationships that are not working, women's much greater freedom. These are all obviously positive things, but they have had unintended consequences that is reinforced, I think, by a certain idea of freedom. It's had huge knock-on effects. I mean, the weaker family means that we have placed huge extra burdens on the social state. I mean, this is obviously one of the reasons for the rapid increase in welfare spending, and because so many of the things that were once done in the domestic realm for free, or often by women, are now being done as paid jobs often in the public sector. So huge extra burdens on the state. The weaker and smaller family is also one of the factors, I think, behind the huge increase in the mental fragility epidemic among young people. Partly relating back to the fact that nearly half of kids are not living with both their biological parents. About 25% of families with dependent children are single-parent families. That's nearly double the European average, by the way. I mean, the family in this country is in a real mess. So you've had this undervaluing, this anywhere bias towards the public realm, and the undervaluing of the family, or the seeing the family, particularly in relation to women, as sort of belonging to our past in some way. It's a sort of constraint. It's seen as a constraint, and that anywhere sort of undervaluing it has had this knock-on effect on public policy. The increase in welfare spending, the mental fragility crisis, the rapid fall in fertility. Obviously, we share that with most other developed countries, but also you might even include in this, because we're undervaluing not just the family and domestic realm, but the attributes associated with it, nurture, care, motherhood, parenthood. These things are not valued. And one of the knock-on effects in that is that care jobs in the public sector are also not valued, hence the recruitment crisis in social care and our dependence on high levels of immigration. So basically I'm calling for a better balance, that we've kind of overshot in some ways, and it's not even popular. I mean, it's sort of a short-term impulse has sort of defeated something that in many ways we would prefer, if given a proper choice, to make different decisions. And just to finish, you can kind of sum up public opinion on this issue and the gap between public opinion and the political class with two statistics from the British social attitude surveys from relatively recent years. So I think 5 or 10 years ago, the question was asked, and it's something they asked relatively frequently, is, do you agree with the statement, a man should go out to work and a woman should stay at home and look after the household and children? Only 9%, I mean, it would probably be less than that now. This was 5 or 10 years ago. Only 9% of British adults support that notion. No one wants to go back to the 1950s. But equally, when asked what their ideal arrangements would be for raising young children, again, only 9% of people say both parents working full time, and yet more than a third of parents, some willingly, some less willingly, are both working full time at present, and that is not how people how most people anyway want to manage things.
Yes, certainly an interesting gap there. I think if we sort of split this problem, or the reasons for this problem, into two roughly spheres, but there will be the cultural problem, as you mentioned, of the devaluation of certain forms of especially how women are organizing their lives, whether motherhood is valued. And then you could also talk about the social policy that potentially flows from that cultural settlement. But to start with the cultural one, and I think one of the key stats or things that's pointed to in part of your book is the fact that the kinds of people who are making decisions about this, high-flying politicians, men or women, but particularly the women who are in politics, are going to be quite unrepresentative of the typical woman, because they will be more career-focused, are less likely to have children, and so on. And so I suppose what lies behind that cultural...
The failure of family policy.
The failure of family policy, that cultural antipathy towards it, perhaps. And I suppose what can be done about it as well. Yeah.
I think there are a few signs that we may be moving in the right direction. But I mean, just to reinforce what you were saying, really, I think there's this... LSE sociologist a few years ago, Catherine Hakim, who talked about adult British women being divided into these three groups: 20% who are very traditional family-focused women, 20% who are very sort of professional-focused women, who may also, in many cases, want to have families as well, but place a very, very high priority, sort of similarly to men, you might say, on full-time professional careers, and 60% of women who she called adaptive, who want to combine, being a mother with having, satisfying and remunerative work, but at least when children are young, are happy to put family obligations first for a few years, perhaps when children are preschool. And I think it's undoubtedly the case that our family policy has been made substantially, by a combination of men and the 20% of women who are very work-focused. And we saw this when, I think it was the 2023 budget, Jeremy Hunt, a Conservative Chancellor, was announcing an extra £4 billion on the childcare subsidy, taking the total amount spent on childcare, I think something like £9 billion a year. And at this time of fiscal retrenchment, nobody batted an eyelid about this extra sum, by the way, which is itself quite revealing. And he actually said, in the course of sort of promoting this extra spending, that women should not waste their talents, bringing up their own children as mothers. And this is. It's sort of extraordinary thing to say in some ways, particularly from a Conservative Chancellor, but perhaps in some ways not surprising, given the kind of dominant ethos, the sort of androgynous ethos of public life, or what you might call a sort of male default version of feminism, and you are beginning to see resistance to this. I quote A well-known American woman, liberal feminist woman, Anne Marie Slaughter, worked for Clinton when Clinton was Secretary of State, runs a big, important think tank, and she talks about how, when she was a young feminist, people talked about how they were taught to kind of respect the competitive professional work their fathers did and rather look down on the caring work their mothers did, and that how now women have obtained a degree of equality, they can now, as it were, use their power and influence to rebalance things and not look at things in such a sort of binary male default kind of way. I mean, I think there are some signs that the kind of Jeremy Hunt view is beginning to shift. I mean, at the sort of bigger level, I think it's interesting to see how, feminism, if you go back 20, 30 years, it was an article of faith of feminism that men and women were not only equal, but essentially the same, the famous sort of blank slate theory. And I think, it's not only, as it were, the sort of self-described conservative feminists like Louise Perry or Mary Harrington who will say that is nonsense. It's even mainstream liberal left feminists like Helen Lewis or, Caroline Criado Perez, who wrote the influential book Invisible Women, acknowledge that there are significant average differences between men and women. And once you do that, then this kind of sort of dogmatic idea that we should be aiming for an absolutely kind of equal distribution of men and women in all roles, in all walks of life, sort of becomes redundant in some ways. And I think that is the sort of first step, I think, towards thinking more sensibly about some of these issues, and the fact that men and women, we probably are more. I mean, in a sense, it doesn't matter whether the differences are biological or cultural, so long as they are chosen. We live in democracies where people's preferences and choices should matter. It seems sort of that a more commonsensical view. You also have, just in parenthesis, this famous thing called the gender equality paradox, which you see in Scandinavian countries like Sweden, where in the most egalitarian countries in the world in terms of sex differences, you actually see an even bigger divide in terms of choices about career and so on. Women cluster overwhelmingly in the public sector, and particularly in public sector caring professions in Sweden, and men cluster overwhelmingly in the private sector and private business. So that is one, I think, positive step. The other thing that has happened is that you are starting to see. We have in the UK, partly for some of the reasons we've just been talking about, that the dominance of an idea of equality that places all the focus on work and sees the family as something to escape from. I mean, our family policy is essentially childcare policy, which is about making it easier for both parents to spend less time in the family. And we have a very miserly, obviously there are areas of support, maternity and paternity pay, and child benefit and so on. But even by European standards, most of these things are pretty miserly. And we don't acknowledge the family in the tax system. We have the couple penalty in the benefit system. All sorts of ways that make it kind of harder for people to form families and stay together, particularly in those very difficult early years when you have these huge pressures. You're climbing the greasy pole at work, and you've got one, possibly two children suddenly, and it puts huge strains on relationships and marriages, which is why you tend to see very high levels of breakup. And if we could redirect some of the existing flows of money, for example, give some of that billion a year we spend on childcare, give it direct to families, and they can then choose whether to make it easier for one of the parents, probably usually the mother, but sometimes the father, to stay at home when children are very young, rather than giving it to professional nursery care organisations. We could end up with a much better family policy than we currently have. But as I say, I mean, we have this very miserly family policy, but we are beginning to see changes there. I mean, interestingly, Nigel Farage, a man with a very keen nose for the direction of the political wind in this country, he used to say that he couldn't possibly talk about improving family policy in this country because he was twice divorced. And I think, that is actually, I mean, he's being honest about this in a way that many politicians are not. But I think it is one of the reasons why so many of these areas have been declared, as it were, beyond the realm of politics by the political class. That these things are a private matter, and we don't have any right to kind of have a view about them, even though they're incredibly important to people's lives and their life chances. Growing up in a stable two-parent family, overwhelmingly better than. But the idea that you might do anything to make that easier and have a family policy that would help support that has been ruled out of bounds. And I think it is partly because politicians' lives tend to be even more chaotic than the average family in Britain. And they've been ever since John Major's famous Back to Basics speech back in the mid 1990s, and which was followed by all these revelations about the family lives and the mistresses of Tory MPs and all. That, and obviously politicians don't like to be hypocritical, and that's a good thing. But it has caused, as Farage said, I can't possibly talk about family life because I'm twice divorced. I mean, that has been the headline in a way. And he's now realised that actually his divorces, these things are too important for his two divorces to get in the way of having a sensible family policy. So actually reform has easily the most progressive family policy. It's in favour of a proper recognition of the family in the tax system, transferable allowances between, because at the moment, I mean, a single earner household in the UK is absolutely is hit incredibly hard in the tax system in a way that is incredibly unfair. He wants to deal that with proper recognition of family in the tax system, as we used to have. He wants to front end child benefit, which would really help, in making it easier again for one parent to stay at home. I mean, if you redirected the childcare subsidy, if you front end child benefit, if you recognise the family in the tax system, you could come to, I'll write about this in the Care Dilemma, you could come to a what I call the home care allowance of about £10,000 a year per child. And that could make all the difference to families that would prefer, just in those first sort of 3 or 4 years, would prefer it if one of them could stay at home. So Farage has sort of, he also perhaps most controversially, perhaps for his own party, is in favour also of ending the 2-child cap in the benefit system. And I suspect that will have an influence on other parties in the next 2 or 3 years, because these things are popular. And the fact, Bridget Phillipson, also, to her credit, I'm critical of Phillipson in a couple of places in the book, but actually to her credit, she has said, very unusually for a British politician, that we should make it easier for young people to have children in this country, which for all sorts of reasons to do with the cost of childcare and housing and the kind of, the relationship difficulties between young men and women and so on. There are many, many reasons for it. Our fertility levels are absolutely crashing. I mean, I think just finally on all of this, I mean, I think two reasons why I think in the medium term we will start to address these issues more seriously is because the decline in fertility, the appalling dependency ratios that we now have, with declining numbers of workers relative to older people who are living longer and longer with huge demands on this. The economics of our current fertility arrangements are just going to become. I mean, they're already a huge sort of drag anchor on the UK economy and the economies of most developed countries now, with more and more public spending required to look after more and more people who are not economically productive. And I think this is the second reason why a lot of these issues are going to come to the fore more, is because actually having children, having a stable family life that makes it easier to have children is good for your mental health. The cliches of sort of mental health are to do with being outward directed rather than kind of introspective, to having responsibility for things other than yourself. And I think those two things will push us in a better direction in some of these things.
Yes, it is very interesting the way it's coming back onto the agenda, and I want to get your thoughts a bit more on that. But one example, you mentioned Helen Lewis, a liberal left feminist who now is willing to talk about this kind of thing, and you also mentioned that famous study about profession preferences in Sweden, where men are being engineers and the women are being nurses. Now, there's a famous interview with Helen Lewis and Jordan Peterson, who likes to talk about that particular stat from 2018, in which she is really going after him for even talking about, heaven forbid for a psychologist, biology and psychological differences between men and women on average, which are creating these kinds of outcomes. But it's interesting that someone like her might have changed her view on it. But it seems to me that a particular change in the political discourse in the past 7 years since then has been the massive rise of trans and everything that has meant for women, and certainly even the more liberal left feminists, but the more intelligent ones are able to notice that actually we can't just completely ignore biology here, right? And this has to be borne in mind. Or for that very obvious matter of women's sports and rape crisis centres and everything else, but also actually it's not just these sort of physical things, but there are temperamental differences and differences in choice, whether that's put down to gender as a more cultural thing or a biological thing, but that this can now be talked about. And would you say that trans has opened the door for that? Yeah,
you're right. I mean, I should have mentioned that, and you're right to mention it. I mean, I think it is another of those factors that because obviously the trans, the trans debate has helped to kind of revive feminism, but framed around biological differences between men and women, which, as it were, the earlier phase of feminism downplayed or even denied. So I think you could argue that we've sort of reached and maybe even passed sort of peak androgyny, and that we will have, that'll enable us to have a more sort of sensible debate about male-female differences and the way that these things play out in our public culture, the way they play out in families, and you have, and I think it also opens the way to an interesting debate about the effects of feminization on public life. I mean, I argue. I mean, I don't really touch on it in the book. I mention it in a couple of places, but I mean, I think I'm sort of essentially arguing that we've not feminized enough in some areas. You can say, the way that we have failed to deal with the social care crisis. We've essentially kind of prioritized childcare funding before social care funding, partly I think because of the kind of the 20% of women who have tended to be most influential in politics, the sort of male default feminist impulse has regarded childcare as our future, allowing men and women to be more or less the same.
Stella Creasy with her baby in the Commons.
Yeah, whereas social care kind of belongs to women's past in some way. And perhaps foreigners can do that. I think that actually, if we had a more representative voice of all women in the political class, I think of course, I'm not saying we shouldn't subsidise childcare, and actually remains too expensive, even though we spend huge amounts on it. These shouldn't be an either or. But I think you look at some of the public policy decisions taken, and you think actually the average woman's voice is not represented sufficiently there. The fact that GDP continues to fail to capture the productive work done in the home, and this creates all sorts of distortions in the decisions we take. I mean, one of the reasons why Jeremy Hunt wanted to spend an extra £4 billion on childcare is to get a tiny number of extra women into the workforce, into the GDP economy workforce. But I mean, the number was kind of small. It was like the equivalent of 60 or 70,000 full-time jobs, which out of a full-time, I think there are something like 25 million full-time jobs in the UK economy. I mean, we're talking about a tiny number. But so you got the kind of undervaluing of certain things. I mean, the undervaluing of motherhood essentially still, and the attributes related to it. You could say we've not feminized enough. In other ways, you might say society has become sort of over-feminized. In the if you accept there are these kind of average male-female differences, one of the famous ones, obviously, men tend to be more aggressive, men tend to be more risk-taking, higher sex drive. I mean, those are sort of some of the sort of basic differences. And these are not binary differences. I mean, these are famously, dimorphic differences. I think it's like sort of overlapping bell curve. So, or the average man is more aggressive than the average woman. There are some women that are more aggressive than some men. We live in societies that are now arguably over-regulated, that the idea of protection from harm, which you might say is a kind of more female principle than a male one, although it's shared obviously by both sexes, that we've become, and that could be partly the fact that the voice of women, 40% of MPs are women now. There are certain institutions where women now dominate. I mean, education, it's been true for quite a long time now. Higher education now increasingly. You've got, the health service is now, any hospital is probably about 85% women now. I mean, you have a few, women are now often half the professional medical staff, as well as like 90% of the nursing staff. You've got a few male consultants still and a few porters. So, quite large areas of the public sector have become female dominated. And that's kind of neither a good thing nor a bad thing in many respects. But you could say, taken as a whole, the new consensus that we're kind of over-regulated, that we're perhaps attributing, we're worrying too much about avoiding harm, which has helped to allow the benefits, the benefit bill to creep up and up and up. That these things may be to do with the greater feminization in society. And the HR department, is 90% female. So, as I said, I'm trying to make a kind of, to the extent that you can talk about the effects of feminization at all, and obviously it's still sort of somewhat taboo perhaps to do so. But I think it's an argument that we should start having in a sort of calm, reasonable way. Of course, it's very difficult to sort of provide evidence. I mean, I made a passing comment about comparing the reaction to the Spanish flu 100 years ago after the First World War with the COVID crisis. The fact that the Spanish flu, a far more virulent virus actually than COVID, killed babies as well as old people. And yet we did absolutely nothing. I mean, indeed, we barely talked about it. Admittedly, it was coming at the end of the First World War. Of course, we were much poorer then. It was a much more brutal society. But 100 years later, a much less virulent virus. We closed down our entire economies and societies. And is that to do with in that 100 years, obviously the voice of women in our politics and our culture has become much, much louder. Are the two things related? Or you could argue it's just because we're a lot richer and therefore men and women would have taken more or less the same decision because we had the kind of ability to do so. Being a richer society, we could protect people from harm more rigorously than 100 years before. I don't know, but it's an argument I think that is worth having. It was dismissed by one of the reviewers of the Care Dilemma, who said, I think rather fatuously, that that can't be true because look, who are the people actually taking the decisions about COVID? It was mainly men, but that's not how these social trends work. I mean, that where men and women are equally affected by the dominant social norms. And what my argument is that those social norms have been affected beneficially in many ways by the much greater influence of women in our politics and society over the last 100 years. So it makes no difference really whether it's individual men or women taking the actual decisions.
And to return to that comment by Jeremy Hunt then, because I think it is very telling, a waste of talent.
Yeah.
I think what was interesting about that is that even if you were to only calculate things in terms of GDP, which is broadly the sort of mistake that's happening here, is that actually, as you spoke about in the first answer, there are all these knock-on problems from family breakdown, from a lack of childcare, that if you take that out, this is, even if you measure it in GDP terms, this is going to cause an enormous problem. But it's very strange that particular part of human life, simply because you can't obviously put a monetary value on it, is just ignored. Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about this the other day, and I think what we've done is we've sort of taken for granted the kind of human stroke family preconditions for productive people, productive growth in our economy. We've just assumed that we can allow the family to become much more fragmented, and for people to, and indeed for people not to have children any longer, and for all of these things to kind of manifest themselves without any effect on the productive economy. But actually, the productive economy has historically been based on sort of a relatively secure family foundation. I should caveat everything I'm saying really by pointing out that obviously not everybody, for many people, family life is miserable and is something they do understandably want to escape from. I'm very lucky. I'm one of 7 children. I got 4 children of my own. The word family has kind of broadly benign connotations for me, and that obviously isn't true of everybody. And obviously but we shouldn't design policy around the people with the worst outcomes. Those people should be looked after, and policy should take them into account. But it's as if we've based policy around a kind of disregard for the family, really, and that is then having a knock-on effect in the productive economy. We've taken those things for granted, and we can't. We need to repair them.
Okay, and so let's broaden this out a bit then. So you mentioned right at the beginning that this, of course, comes in this series, and broadly the thing that's linking all of these is a sort of philosophy of society that's focusing more on individual freedom. And so if we imagine, say, that the stay-at-home mum is the somewhere, while the careerist woman is the anywhere, that can be very well linked to your first book in the series, The Road Somewhere. And I suppose, I think it's interesting that book continues to have a major currency, and I suppose there is that key part of it, the somewheres and the anywheres. Were you surprised initially at how widely that came to be adopted as almost the central political framing of in particular, the Brexit vote, but how it's sort of continued to be used and to sort of speak to so many people?
Yeah, I was surprised, pleasantly surprised that I was very lucky with the timing of the book. It came out in early 2017. It was one of the first books to come out with a sort of... I started writing it, by the way, just before the Brexit referendum in, June 2016. I finished writing it just after Trump was elected in November 2016. I wrote it quite quickly because a lot of these things were things I've been thinking out for quite a long time, and I was kind of recycling quite a lot of stuff I'd already written. So I was able to do it quite quickly, and then it came out, I think, in March 2017. And it did, and it sort of captured, people were kind of looking around for explanations, and I think it, of course, it got caricatured, and I think, the Anywhere Somewhere, it makes it sound very binary, and to some extent it is quite binary, but I mean, just to the opportunity to clarify, if you read the book, you'll see that there are many kind of gradations of Anywhere and many gradations of Somewhere. There's quite a big in-betweener group. I mean, my estimations of the, having said that, I mean, I had my nose in the British Social Attitude Surveys and other opinion and value surveys for quite a long time, and I did the work, and I think I invented the labels. I didn't invent the worldview groups. I think they are out there. You can argue about the proportions that I gave to the different labels. I mean, I talk about the Anywheres being 20, 25, maybe 30% of the population, and the Somewheres more like 45, 50%, and the Anywhere, and the kind of, there was that in-betweener group, people who identify with the kind of mixture of the two worldviews. And it was meant, obviously, as a sort of big picture thing. I mean, people play. It just became a sort of parlor game. Are you an Anywhere or Somewhere? I mean, I think, and lots of people would obviously feel they don't fit exactly into either category. And I think, I mean, the other thing I think that I get misunderstood on is I'm not saying Somewhere good, Anywhere bad. Obviously, I'm an Anywhere. I'm from an Anywhere background. Most of the people in the kind of media and political class are Anywheres. And what I'm saying is that both of these worldviews in their mainstream forms, at least, are perfectly decent. The problem is one has been over-dominant. Since probably the 1990s, the Anywhere worldview has completely dominated, whether the parties, the centre-left or the centre-right, are in power. And that's unbalanced our politics, and it's left a very large minority of the population feeling unrepresented. And that has been the problem. And I'm not advocating that we should replace Anywhere rule with Somewhere rule. That what we need is a kind of, rather like with the care dilemma, we need a kind of new balance. And we need a new generation of politicians who can speak to both Anywheres and Somewheres. And that has, one of the disappointments. I mean, obviously these things don't just happen overnight, and the book only came out in 2017, but that has definitely not happened. We have not seen, a sort of bridge building. And incidentally, I think, the care and family issues and the neglect of them and the things you might do about them, care, family, and indeed fertility issues, offer an opportunity. I mean, although, being pro-family and pro-natalism, pro-fertility sort of still tends to be associated with the right, but actually to achieve many of these goals that might be seen as small c conservative goals, you often need quite liberal means. I mean, you need proper welfare support for young families. You need opportunities for women to more easily combine work and family, which might also include more equal distribution of the domestic burden within the home. There's some evidence that is a sort of pro-fertility factor, although I have to say that the fertility collapse is also happening in the egalitarian Scandinavian countries. Good jobs for non-university educated men to make them more desirable partners for women. I mean, all of these things you might say are kind of, quite liberal or sort of social democratic things that, so liberal means to conservative ends. I think there has been some recognition by, you could sort of see it in the fact that there was quite a few, in the course of the sort of Brexit and post-Brexit debate, people felt a certain kind of, some Remainers were prepared to concede a certain remorse about their neglect of somewhere priorities. Quite a lot of the people that ended up, after all, implementing Brexit were Tories who'd supported Remain. But you then, soon after you had the Brexit deal done, you then had the Boris wave, and the inability to, that was partly a lack of attention to detail, but it was also partly a sort of sense that, we must, still very much influenced by a kind of anywhere impulse, we must prove, having done this nationalist thing that was something that's easily caricaturable as a nationalist thing, as almost a kind of Little Englander thing, we had to prove our globalist credentials to the kind of dominant anywhere worldview, and hence the neglect of what was happening on immigration. No one was keeping an eye on the details, the fact that they were liberalising the student visas again, they were being very open about people's right to bring independence and so on. That because those are the two big divides between anywheres and somewheres in recent politics are over national sovereignty and immigration, and post 2016, post Brexit, neither of those issues were really taken. Well, Brexit itself was obviously a reclamation in some ways of national sovereignty, but it hasn't been adopted with any vigour. In many respects, we're still sort of in the regulatory sphere. We're often still part of the kind of EU arrangements. Obviously, these things take time, but the anywhere political class that remains in charge has not sort of picked up the opportunities of Brexit with any great vigour, and of course ended up being extraordinarily laissez-faire about immigration. So. Although my book may have helped in some circles to sort of frame thinking about it, it certainly has not had a huge impact on politics.
Well, I wonder if it speaks not so much to a weakness in the thesis, but perhaps in how it can be used rhetorically, because, of course, it was mainly a plea for the anywheres to listen to the somewheres, roughly, but nevertheless, it does somewhat imply, or at least it can be taken to imply, that the anywheres are these wonderful cosmopolitan types and they don't have these backward views about various things, and that maybe sometimes we'll let them have their Brexit, but as you say, we'll sort of ignore the general political priorities of this group and go on and doing what we're doing. And that almost, someone who, in my mind, imagines himself to be a sort of worldly somewhere is someone like James O'Brien, who goes on LBC and hears these phone calls from average members of the public and thinks, oh, they're so bigoted, they're so backward, etc., but actually is not a particularly sophisticated thinker, it's fair to say. And in many ways, you can imagine that he's using that framing to imagine that simply because he has certain views about immigration, he's socially superior. So perhaps it adds to that divide.
Yeah, I think there is a kind of high status, low status thing attached to it. That the better educated, more affluent people tend to be better travelled and more likely to have connections in other parts of the world. Benefit from openness in a way that perhaps people with more with skills that are more open to competition, as it were. Not many corporate lawyers felt threatened by free movement, whereas obviously plumbers and tradesmen of various kinds would have felt threatened by it. And also, we've had a kind of flip on attachment to the nation state. Used to be something very much that was kind of top down. Elites were the people who, as it were, defined the nation and ran the nation, and you had to literally press gang people to join the Royal Navy to project British power in the 18th and 19th century. I think the lower down the social scale you went, often the kind of the least attachment you had often to the country, that the country belonged, as it were, to the people who owned it. And you've seen that flip in the course of perhaps the later part of the 20th century and into the 21st century. You've seen, particularly people in kind of rich developed countries, but lower status people in rich countries, their attachment to their successful country is an important part of their identity. And it's something they also benefit from in a way that perhaps the more footloose people who can earn their living in different places don't need the nation state. They don't need the welfare state. They don't need the support of the nation in the way that people in the kind of middle and lower end of the social scale do. So it's sort of natural in a way that people are going to be, combined with that sense of greater attachment. If you haven't gone to a residential university 200 miles from where you live, you've tended to stay within the certain area all your life. It doesn't mean to say you're bigoted. You may well have friends from ethnic minorities, or from different social groups, and actually, some ways often do have much more varied social networks often than anywheres who tend to actually have very monocultural connections in terms of education, in terms of sort of media consumption. They will often live in much narrower worlds. It was interesting around the Brexit vote how so many Remain voters I knew were sort of saying they didn't know a single person who voted Brexit, whereas every Brexit voter would have known lots of people who voted Remain. One of the kind of new dividing issues on this is whether it's legitimate or not to feel uncomfortable about demographic change. I wrote a piece in the Evening Standard a few weeks ago that attracted a lot of hostile criticism from the sort of James O'Brien end of the spectrum, for just pointing out how the dramatic demographic changes in London have been. Like, I think it's only 20% of London school children are white British. And the sort of response of, well, kind of what difference does kind of ethnicity make? We're all the same. I think, you can understand it comes from a good place in some ways, and you can understand it. Much of the time, it's sort of true, but equally, this isn't just about people's skin color. It's about different social norms, different attitudes to religion. In many cases, perhaps different languages, many people in London not really being integrated into sort of British culture. I mean, I talked about a bus stop test, a kind of bus stop test of integration. How, if you could sort of judge a neighbourhood or a town or indeed a country as integrated, if you had a reasonable chance of meeting somebody at a bus stop from a different ethnicity to you, with whom you could share a joke about something you'd both seen on the media the previous night. That was widely ridiculed, but actually I think the idea that that we all share a sort of degree of cultural space. Obviously, there can be significant differences within that.
Because, that's not an enormously high bar, is it?
Well, no. But I think. And it's also, I think it affects this, the argument about crime at the moment. I mean, obviously there's a level of kind of disorder associated with lots of young men in asylum hotels. I mean, obviously, there aren't that many of them, and we're not talking about a kind of huge national problem. We're talking about, 250 or 300 or whatever it is. And it's obviously something that's been highlighted by the critics of the asylum system, the immigration system, sometimes perhaps unfairly, but I think, people like Fraser Nelson have rightly been kind of, as it were, fact-checking some of the claims made about increases in crime. And it is true, overall crime rates have fallen, although certain shoplifting has obviously gone up and certain kinds of petty crime have. But I think one of the reasons for a belief that crime perhaps not crime is almost the wrong word, but kind of that disorder, low-level disorder has increased, is because more and more people are living, more and more people from the historic majority, the white British majority, are living in areas where they are no longer in the majority. And I think that for some people, not for everybody, but for some people, that creates a sense of a sort of disorder to a once relatively stable way of life. And that is obviously long been true of London. The white British became a minority in London probably back at the end of the 1990s, at the beginning of the 2000s. I think it's probably, it remained a majority white city because a lot of the immigrants to London were non-British whites from other European countries or from America or wherever. But I think it probably may now be even majority non-white. Anyway, it's just it has been this extraordinary change and relatively quick. I think you only have to go back to the 1980s, and London was like sort of 80%, 85% white British, and you look at the country as a whole. I mean, we were in 2000 the country was about 90% white British, and it is now, certainly if you look at England, it is barely 70% white British. So that means that a huge number of areas the white British will no longer be, and obviously that no longer be in the majority. That's obviously true in many of the big metropolitan centres, and it's starting to be true. I think this is one of the reasons why kind of reform strikes such an emotional nerve, is that this is starting to be true in many other places too, in the outside of metropolitan Britain. And in some places that is working fine. In other places it isn't working so well, and it is causing friction. And even if it isn't, people, it is possible to feel that change is loss. I mean, it's a kind of old conservative notion that change is loss, but I think it is for many people, and as is often been said, nobody ever voted for it. Indeed, people have constantly voted against it, and yet it hasn't happened. I mean, this is the big, the biggest point on the somewhere charge sheet, to the anywhere class in the dock, is that you have just simply not listened to us on this, because you haven't felt it in the same way. It's a lack of empathy, and I think, and the anywheres let themselves off by saying it's racist or nativist or xenophobic to think and feel that, and I simply don't think it is. I mean, you have it's an extraordinary small number of people who now say, and it would probably include most of the 150,000 people who went on the Tommy Robinson March, that you have to be white to be truly British. I think something like 3% of people say you have to be white to be truly British. But that doesn't mean to say that you are, that you think it's that it's fine to live in a society where there are no, there are common rules have been eroded, that the kind of dominant social norms are ignored by people, or people are living parallel lives and can't communicate at the bus stop. People don't want that.
A good example of the way that operates, really, that sort of mindset, which let's finish on this, is that, well, as you mentioned demographic change in London. Now, in 2022, Sajid Javid, I think then the Home Secretary, responded to a tweet by Nigel Farage pointing out that London, from I think the centres, London, Manchester and Birmingham were now minority white cities, with the immortal phrase, "So what?" That very dismissive attitude. Now, 3 years later, Sajid Javid is among the 20 or so members of a government commission on community cohesion, which it feels necessary to have, which is one data point in of itself, but which itself describes Britain as a tinderbox, thanks to uncontrolled immigration. And I think that just really illustrates the way that you can kind of, the anywhere worldview can wish these realities away and sort of poo-poo it as low status, and then actually it very much comes back to bite them.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I hadn't noticed the Sajid flip, as it were. I don't think it's a government commission, isn't it? It's it's
convened by the government, but it's independent.
Yeah, Yeah, I remember being sort of slightly depressed when I saw the names. I mean, they were pretty well all from the London political class. I mean, I sort of
Fraser Nelson as well is on there. So
is Fraser Nelson
yes,
on it?
yes,
Right,
exactly.
yeah. But I mean, I sort of thought, you need someone who's been a head of social services in a Rochdale or a Rotherham or a retired senior police officers from these places, people who kind of know about, I think Fraser Nelson is not completely wrong when he says we do have a success story to tell about integration, and that is particularly true of certain groups and certain places, and it's certainly truer. It's true in Harrow, in parts of northwest London where you have, generally speaking, successful, affluent British Indian class, who live in the same streets perfectly happily as similar white British people, and that will be true in the kind of affluent suburbs of Manchester, of Leicester, of Oadby, and it's been true for many decades. And you also have, most famously in the mill towns, you have had parallel lives in not everywhere in the mill towns, but in many of them, people just living very, very separately and living according to very different norms, whether when it comes to religion, sex differences, attitudes to alcohol, living as cheek by jowl with strangers, really. The truth is, it is very, very difficult to say anything concrete about becoming a more integrated society if we are also a liberal society. I mean, the whole point of modern liberalism in many ways is that we can all, among the majority community as well as minorities, we can all live according to our own goals and our own ends, so long as we kind of obey the law and pay our taxes. Liberalism is not a philosophy of strong gods, and it therefore opens itself to it is its kind of weak flank in a way. I mean, liberalism has very little to say about these issues of how people live well together, particularly people from different backgrounds. Because you do require more than just paying your taxes and obeying the law. I think you do require, quite strong shared social norms for people to feel comfortable and for people not to feel a strong in-group, out-group. We're all kind of programmed to have a degree of in-group, out-group feeling, both in our kind of micro contexts and in broader contexts. And you can't just kind of ignore the kind of human social psychology of in-group, out-group feeling. And it is very, very difficult, I think, to combine the kind of requirement of stronger integration social norms with while maintaining an attachment to modern liberalism, which is, I'm sort of in a way more pessimistic about integration or what it even really means than I would have been perhaps a few years ago. But I think the one thing is absolutely clear is that the best form of integration is to have very, very low immigration for quite a long time to give us time to digest the differences that have already arrived on this island. And you saw that in America. America went through a huge period of immigration in the late 19th, early 20th century, and it then stopped it in the early 1920s, right through to the mid-late 1960s, was a period of very, very low immigration in America, not coincidentally the period of its kind of most social democratic politics, if you like. New Deal and post-New Deal America was very, very like a European country in many ways, because it was a cohesive country, and it's partly the effect of war. War pulls people together. We haven't had a war for a long time. I don't suppose we want a war in order to become better integrated and connected to each other. But I mean, I think, there are a few little things you can do. Something that I actually picked up from Trevor Phillips. I mean, this idea that we should measure integration in neighbourhoods and schools, and talk about it more, particularly in those areas of the country where we have our most problems. We should have, there's this thing called the index of dissimilarity. I mean, there are ways that you can kind of work out how integrated or segregated a neighbourhood is. It's relatively easy to do it with schools, and our schools, by the way, are pretty segregated. And we should publish these figures. Local authorities should be required to measure these things and publish them, and then there would be great competition not to be, the local authority that is the most segregated in the UK. I think there are kind of little things like that could, and obviously there are issues to do with language teaching, and we don't even have a very sophisticated language to talk about these things. I mean, it's good that we do talk about them, but we tend to just go around in circles. And I'd be very surprised. I mean, I hope something concrete and positive does come out of this commission. I'm not holding my breath. I suspect whatever does come out will be in the nature of a small number of people of goodwill from all the various communities in Leicester or wherever it is, getting together for a big breakfast, 3 times a year, or something like that, which doesn't really affect anything on the ground. Let's just have an immigration slowdown for 20 or 30 years, so we can digest the great influx that we've had in the last 25.
Quite. Well, David Goodhart, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Well, thanks for having me.
Now, after the horrifying killing of Charlie Kirk, the reactions to it have become a litmus test for political attitudes worldwide. Nowhere more so than in Germany, where outrageously the right-wing activist was widely victim-blamed for his own killing. So what does that say about the German media's extreme bias towards the left, and how American political discourse reverberates out across the world? Well, to discuss that, I'm very pleased to be joined once again on The Sceptic by Eugippius, who is our faithful Germany correspondent and the author of the venerable Substack Eugippius, A Plague Chronicle. Welcome back, Eugippius.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a privilege and a pleasure.
Yeah, very good to have you here. So there's been a horrifying killing of Charlie Kirk a couple of weeks ago, and you've been writing in particular about how that has ended up being covered and talked about in Germany. And well, I think there's been a lot that's interesting to it, but tell us about some of the things people have been saying. But some of these reactions have been quite ghoulish, haven't they?
Yeah, so it's bizarre on a few levels. One is that Charlie Kirk is not really known in Germany. Before his assassination, I would say, outside of some dissident right circles, he's just totally not known at all. He's an American political activist. That's not that surprising. And so there's no real reason for this story to take the dimensions it did, that especially German state media gave it. But within a few hours of the assassination, really on the morning of the 11th, already you had state media personalities coming out and making quite slanderous characterizations of Kirk and who he was, so calling him a right-wing extremist, a racist, a sexist, a misogynist, a spiritual arsonist. There, Elmar Tevison, who's an American, the Washington, D.C. correspondent for ZDF, which is state broadcast media, and he gave 3 different podcast appearances. He repeated this lie that Kirk had advocated for stoning homosexuals to death. Oh, he's been compared to a political satirist for WDR, another state media broadcast, had this involved metaphor whereby Kirk was Hitler and his assassin was von Stauffenberg. Really harsh and quite unbalanced historical analogies and characterizations. And it's been sort of a spectacle and very strange. And what it's caused the Kirk story to linger in German media for days, because this has provoked a backlash and a huge controversy. People are shocked about these unnecessary characterizations. And I don't know how the coverage in England has been or the UK, but this is not unusual. Other people, some of my readers, some Norwegians, Scandinavians say it's been very similar there, though their media is smaller and it's not get as much exposure. So many of the same talking points cropping up all at once, which is very curious. There's clearly been sort of cross-pollination and a desire to brand Charlie Kirk as politically unspeakable and beyond the pale and so forth. Yeah, it's very, very bizarre and interesting, and I would never have expected this kind of reaction. I thought this would have been a minor story in Germany, to be honest.
And one of the interesting dynamics here, I think, is how these American political events and narratives cross-pollinate, as you say, across to Europe. And I think it's often in quite a low-resolution way, it's fair to say. So, as you say, this claim about him having said gay people should be stoned, but it was obviously not true, but that's come over. And similarly, I've been writing about how these claims about the killer supposedly being a groyper or far-right have been transmitted as well, including in right-wing British newspapers like the Daily Telegraph, which is quite extraordinary. But it's interesting, isn't it, that when that narrative comes over from America in the rest of the West, it's often the more extreme left-wing side of it.
Yeah, that's right. So you only get that side, and then there's this additional distortion because of in Germany because of the language barrier. So they're speaking to audiences who have no independent knowledge of or even access to the MAGA movement or people around Trump or Charlie Kirk or anything he actually said. So they have an additional degree of freedom, and but it's still I always think that. State media in Germany in particular has always reached a new low, and it's not going to get worse than this. And the whole Kirk episode, it was just a level lower than I've seen them behave in the past. And the idea of going after and defaming a dead man, a murdered man from another country who has nothing to do with German politics, with whom Germans have no quarrel at all, it's just bizarre.
And so in America, a typical organ of this kind of global liberalism would be the New York Times, say. But as you mentioned in one of your pieces, actually, the New York Times has not been so outspoken on this particular issue, partly because I suppose they're very aware that the right does pay a lot of attention to what they say, and they want to be seen to be whiter than white to some extent here on this particular issue of political violence. And so there is actually a bit of a constraint in the American media space at times. But then once that, let's say, New York Times view of the world is filtered through to the German political system and others, but Germany in particular, there's less nuance, it seems, and because there isn't that kind of backlash expected. Although, as you say, actually, there has been quite a backlash against these narratives. But, I suppose, did that surprise you as well?
So a number of points here. One is that the German press is perhaps among the European media environments one of the most enslaved to and downstream from American media. So we often report on things that happen in Germany if they're international stories along lines set by the New York Times. It's really very much subordinate, and reporting on American politics is almost always secondary to leading American papers. So Washington Post, New York Times are the two you can really find headlines literally plagiarized the next day from what appears in major American.
That's the end of the free part of the podcast. If you'd like to listen to the bonus interview, you'll need to become a regular donor to the Daily Sceptic. For as little as £5 a month, not only will you be able to watch or listen to the whole podcast, you'll also be able to access articles behind our paywall and join our discussion forum on Discord, where you'll have an opportunity to discuss the latest content on the Daily Sceptic with other donors, members of the editorial team, and some of your favourite contributors. Once you've become a donor, log in to the Daily Sceptic using the same email, and you'll find a link to the premium version of the podcast on the homepage, including instructions about how to listen to it on your favourite podcasting app. Remember, you can access all this bonus content for as little as £5 a month. Just go to dailyskeptic.org/donate.